In the autumn of 1886, in the Wind River country of Wyoming Territory, a man wrapped his cabin in sheep's wool. Not a rug by the hearth, not a blanket on the bed. The whole outside of the house, packed and bound in raw fleece, wall to roofline, like a lamb dressed for a blizzard it hadn't been born into yet. People rode out of their way just to see it. Some laughed, some crossed themselves. Nobody understood it. Not yet. Because that same winter, the coldest in 10 years, was already forming somewhere north of the Absarokas, gathering itself the way a fist gathers before a blow. And it was going to ask every soul in that valley the same question. What have you done to survive me? Most of them would fail that test. One man, wrapped in wool and ridicule in equal measure, was going to pass it, and the town would never let him live it down, in the best possible way. Stay through to the end, because the coldest night in 10 years was coming for all of them, and only one house was going to still have a fire lit by morning. If you want to see who that fire belonged to, subscribe now, because you are not going to believe what the thermometer read. Nobody in Split Rock, Wyoming had ever seen a wall like it, and nobody quite knew what to do with the man who built one. Some said he'd caught something from his grief, the way a fever catches from a bad well. Some said it plainer than that. Either way, by the first snowfall, the whole valley had an opinion about the Wolf-Fool's cabin, and not one of those opinions had been tested yet. That was about to change. His name was Ezra Vane, and by the time the leaves turned that year, he had already buried a wife and a summer's worth of pride in the same 6 months. Mercy Vane had died in February, in a cabin so cold that the water bucket by the door had frozen solid by morning, and the fire, banked as carefully as any man knew how to bank it, had still burned down to nothing by 4 a.m. She had been sick before the cold came. The cold had simply finished what the sickness started. Ezra never said that out loud. He didn't have to. Everyone in the valley knew the shape of that kind of dying, and everyone in the valley, in their own private way, was afraid of it happening to them. So when the snow melted that spring, and Ezra started walking his fence line, talking to himself about still air and the wool trick, the town of Split Rock did what small towns do with a grieving man who starts acting strange. They watched him. They talked about him. And on a Tuesday in June, when Otis Pruitt saw Ezra Vane loading 40 raw fleeces onto a borrowed wagon instead of selling them at the going rate in Lander, Otis said the thing that stuck. Boys gone soft in the head, fixing to live in a sheep's coat. The name traveled faster than the wagon did. By the following Sunday, half the valley was calling it the Wolf-Fool's Cabin. Widow Halsey, who ran the boarding house and knew every piece of gossip in the territory before the Telegraph did, told anyone who'd listen that Ezra Vane had gone the way grief sometimes took a man. Quiet on the outside, ruined on the inside. Children took to bleating at him like sheep when he passed on the road, laughing and running before he could so much as turn his head. Ezra heard it said to his face outside the mercantile, heard Otis say it again louder the second time to make sure the whole porch got it. He didn't argue. He loaded his fleeces and drove on, and the silence he kept was mistaken by nearly everyone for shame. It wasn't shame. It was arithmetic. He was already counting inches and degrees in his head, and he didn't have time to argue with men who hadn't done the counting themselves. A humbled man argues. A man who already knows the answer just keeps working. He had learned the arithmetic from his grandfather, Rhys Vane, a Welsh wool grader who had spent 40 years buying and grading fleece for the mills before he ever set foot in America. Reese had raised Ezra for 3 years after Ezra's own father died, in a cold stone house in the Welsh hills, where the wind came off the sea like it had a grudge. The old man used to run raw wool through his fingers by lamplight, testing the crimp, judging the grease content. And he'd talk while he worked, mostly to himself, mostly about the same thing. Wool doesn't fight the cold, boy, he'd say. It just gives the cold nothing to hold on to. Ezra hadn't understood it as a boy. He understood it now. His grandfather had explained it plainly enough once, on a night when the wind had found every gap in the stone. Cold didn't move through wool the way it moved through a plank wall or a pane of glass. It got lost in there. Every fiber held a little pocket of still air, and it was the stillness, not the wool itself, that did the work. Millions of tiny rooms with no draft in any of them. A wall that breathes and doesn't bleed, Reese used to call it. That's what keeps a lamb alive on a mountain in a storm that kills grown men in their coats. Ezra remembered one night in particular, a night the sea wind had rattled every shutter in the house, and his grandfather had set him down by the fire with a raw hank of fleece in each hand, one greasy and unwashed, one carded thin and clean. "Tell me which one's warmer," the old man had said. Ezra, 8 years old, had guessed the clean one, because it looked finer, more like a blanket ought to look. Reese had shaken his head and pulled the greasy hank apart slow, showing the boy how the crimp in each fiber locked against its neighbor and trapped 100 tiny rooms of still air between them, rooms too small for a draft to ever find its way through. "It isn't the wool that's warm, boy," he'd said. "It's the stillness inside it. Cold can't hunt what it can't get a hold of." Ezra had carried that sentence across an ocean and half a continent, and in the summer of 1886, grieving and half desperate and out of better ideas, he decided to build a wall out of it. The first man to tell him he was wrong to his face, and the only one whose opinion Ezra actually weighed, was Hollis Bragg. Hollis had built more barns, cabins, and grain sheds in the Wind River Valley than any other 3 men combined, and he hadn't done it by being careless. He rode out to Ezra's claim in July, looked at the stacked fleece drying on the fence rails, and didn't laugh. He asked questions instead, which was worse. "Wool holds water," Hollis said. "You pack that wet against green logs, you're not building a wall. You're building a sponge. Come spring, you'll have black rot eating your studs from the inside, and you won't smell it till the wall's already dead." He wasn't wrong. Wet wool did rot. Wet wool did draw mice, and mice chewed tunnels through insulation the way water found cracks in a dam. And a mouse tunnel in a wall was a straight highway for winter air. Hollis raised every one of those objections, and Ezra didn't have a clever answer for any of them that day. He only had one thing to say. "I know," he told Hollis. "That's why I'm not done figuring it out yet." Hollis wasn't satisfied with that, and he said so. "You lose one wall to rot in January, Ezra. You don't get a second chance at January. You'll freeze before you diagnose it." It was a fair warning, the kind a careful man gives another careful man, not the kind meant to wound. Ezra respected him too much to pretend otherwise. "Then, I'd best not lose the wall," he said. Hollis rode off shaking his head, but he didn't ride off laughing, and something in that difference mattered more than Ezra let on. A man like Hollis Bragg didn't waste good advice on somebody he'd already written off. The building took him from the 2nd week of July to the 3rd week of October, and he did nearly all of it alone, with a dog and a stubborn kind of grief for company. The dog's name was Rook, a black and tan shepherd mix Mercy had raised from a pup, and Rook had taken to following Ezra everywhere since she died, as if the dog understood that this was the only man left to guard. By the third week of July, Ezra had shored up the cabin's original log walls, chinking every gap with a mortar of clay and wood ash so no draft could sneak through the old seams. A full day's work just to press the mortar in two, cracks the width of a knife blade. His knuckles split and bleeding by sundown. Pull the old chink loose, pack the new mortar in, smooth it flat with a thumb gone raw. He did that motion 1,000 times before the walls were sealed. By the second week of August, he had built a second skin around the whole structure, a lattice of thin pine slats, standing 2.5 inches proud of the log wall, creating a channel he could pack floor to eave. He'd hauled every one of those slats up from the sawmill in Lander himself, 22 miles each way, 3 trips with a borrowed wagon, because he didn't have the money to pay for delivery on top of the wool. Into that channel went the wool, cleaned in the creek, dried for 6 full weeks on raised racks so no green moisture remained trapped in the fiber. Then teased apart by hand, hank by hank, until it lofted soft and open instead of matting flat. He packed it loose into the wall channel. Not tight, loose. Because tight wool crushed its own air pockets and stopped being insulation at all and turned back into just another cold, dead layer. He learned that the hard way. A section he'd packed too firm in early August tested cold to the touch a week later, and it cost him the better part of a week's labor to pull it back out, reloft it, and repack it properly. By the third week of September, the wool was in on every wall. Over it he stretched a layer of tarred canvas, and over the canvas split cedar shakes, so that from the road the house looked almost ordinary, until a person got close enough to see the wool showing grey-white at the eaves like a collar. He used 41 raw fleeces in total, better than 300 pounds of wool, bought and bartered from 3 different ranches at a cost of just under $60. Money he didn't have much of, and had earned mostly by breaking horses for neighbors who paid him in coin instead of pity. The final wall stood 14 inches thick, wool to wool, log to shake. At the center of the room he built a stone hearth 8 feet across, a full cord of river rock hauled and mortared by hand, so the mass of it could hold heat through the night, the way his grandfather always said. Stone held a fire's memory long after the flame itself had died down. The wall keeps yesterday alive, Reese used to say. And by the third week of October, when Ezra split cedar shakes for the last row of the roofline, with frost already silvering the grass at dawn, he had built his whole cabin around trying to make that sentence true. He had burned through 6 cords of firewood, just keeping himself fed and working through the build season, and he had 11 cords stacked and ready for whatever winter was coming. He did not yet know how close that number would come to mattering. There was one more measurement he kept returning to that autumn, scratched into a scrap of ledger paper he pinned beside the door. 14 inches of wool wall against logs that used to stand bare at 6. 22 miles each way to the sawmill. 3 trips. 41 fleeces. Better than 300 pounds. $59 and change spent on wool alone, against a season's worth of ridicule that hadn't cost him a cent but had cost him something anyway. He read that scrap of paper most evenings before bed, not because he doubted the arithmetic, but because doubting was easier to survive than hoping, and he needed the numbers to hold the hope up for him until winter came to check his work. In between the hauling and the hammering, there were quieter evenings too. Ezra took to sitting on the porch step at dusk once the day's packing was done, Rook's head heavy on his knee, watching the light go long and gold over the sagebrush flats. He talked to Mercy on those evenings the way a man talks to someone who isn't there anymore but still deserves to be told how the work is going. He told her about the wool, about her father-in-law's aphorism, about the way the valley was laughing at him. He never once told her he regretted starting. Those evenings were the only rest the summer gave him. 10 or 15 quiet minutes before the next day's hauling began again at first light. Hollis Bragg rode out a second time in the middle of August, not to argue this time, but to look. He walked the length of the packed section without a word, ran a thumb along the seam where canvas met cedar shake, and studied the drip gap Ezra had cut at the base of the wall. A small thing, easy to miss, the kind of detail only a builder would think to check. "Where'd you learn to leave a weep gap like that?" Hollis asked, and there wasn't mockery in the question anymore. Only the plain curiosity of one craftsman sizing up another's work. Ezra told him about the sour wool he'd torn out in July, about the mistake and the fix. Hollis nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's revising an opinion in real time, but isn't ready to say so out loud yet. He didn't take back a single one of his objections that day. But he didn't repeat them either. And for Hollis Bragg, that was as close to a compliment as the summer was going to get. The first failure came in late August, 3 weeks into packing the north wall, the wall that took the worst of the valley wind. Ezra woke one morning to a smell he didn't like. Damp wool, faintly sour, the smell of something starting to go wrong in a place he couldn't see. He tore the shakes off that section of wall by hand, ripped back the canvas, and found it. A 6-foot run of wool gone dark and matted at the base, water heavy, already souring toward rot. He'd made 2 mistakes. He'd packed that section during a week of rain without covering his work at day's end, and he'd built the canvas layer without a gap at the bottom for trapped moisture to escape. He sat on the ground outside that wall for a long time, Rook beside him, and he did not feel like a man who was winning an argument with the whole valley. He felt like a man about to lose the same fight that had already taken his wife. The smell of that sour wool put him right back in the room where Mercy had died. The smell of a house that had failed to keep something alive. For a while, he let himself believe Hollis Bragg had been right all along, and that the whole wall, the whole idea, was rot waiting to happen everywhere else too. But he got up. He pulled every foot of ruined wool out of that wall by hand, burned it in a pit well clear of the house, and rebuilt the section with 2 changes, a 1/2-inch drip gap at the base of the canvas so any moisture that gathered could weep out instead of pooling in, and a firm rule for himself going forward: no wool packed within a day of rain. No exceptions, ever. The wall he rebuilt in September never gave him trouble again. It had failed once, and it had taught him something a wall that never failed, never could have. By November, the work was done. The mockery had not stopped. If anything, the finished cabin gave the town something new to laugh at. Its pale, woolly eaves visible from the road, but the laughter had a different sound to it now. Quieter, less certain. Ezra didn't notice the change. He was watching something else. Rook stopped sleeping by the door that year. For 3 winters running, the dog had slept on the cold planks nearest the threshold, closest to whatever came in from outside. In the first week of December, Rook moved instead to the exact center of the room, against the warm base of the stone hearth, and would not be coaxed back to the door, no matter how Ezra called him. 2 days later, the geese that usually lingered on the river until Christmas went over the valley in a single long formation, 3 weeks early, calling the whole way like they were being chased. Old Ansel Kruger, who had read weather off the sky and the animals for 60 years and had never once been badly wrong about it, stood outside the mercantile on the 9th of December and said only, "Something's coming that hasn't got a name yet." Nobody laughed at Ansel. Nobody ever laughed at Ansel. Down at the Pruitt place, the sheep bunched tight against the leeward side of the barn 2 full days before anyone would have expected them to, standing shoulder to shoulder in a knot instead of scattered across the pasture the way they always were. And on the night of the 11th, the wind that had been pushing steadily out of the northwest for a week simply stopped. Every branch in the valley went motionless. The smoke from every chimney in Split Rock rose straight up instead of leaning east, and the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of something holding its breath before it hit. Ezra lay awake that night, listening to nothing at all, which was somehow louder than any wind had ever been. And Rook never once left the hearth. It arrived on the 13th of December, and the old-timers who lived through it would go the rest of their lives calling it the Broken Moon Winter, for the strange bone-white ring that had circled the moon 3 nights before it struck. It came down out of Canada with no mercy and no negotiation in it, the temperature falling from 11 above to 22 below in under 6 hours. Then, further still, before the sun rose again. By the morning of the 14th, the thermometer nailed to the wall of the Split Rock trading post read 44 degrees below zero, and the wind that had gone dead still 3 days before came back at better than 50 miles an hour, driving snow sideways so hard a man couldn't see his own hand at arm's length. Nature had arrived, and nature, as it always did in that country, did not care one particle for reputations. It only asked one question of every wall in the valley: can the cold find its way in? Cabin after cabin answered wrong. Woodpiles that should have lasted the week burned down to nothing in a single brutal night, because green log walls with no true insulation drank heat the way a dry field drinks rain. Livestock froze standing up in draws where they'd huddled for shelter. 3 families packed into the Split Rock trading post before the second night was out, because their own hearts couldn't hold a room above freezing anymore. The Broken Moon Winter did not care that Split Rock had laughed at a man in a sheep's wool coat. It did not care about reputations, apologies, or good intentions. It only cared about walls and whether they held. It simply judged, the way it always had, the way it always would. On the second night of the storm, the worst of it, Ezra's north wall, the same wall that had failed him once in August, took the storm's hardest test. The stovepipe vent above the hearth, the one place in the whole insulated shell where warm air met open sky, iced over from the outside, choked by driven snow that froze solid the instant it struck the cold metal collar. Smoke began to back down into the cabin instead of drawing up and out. Ezra woke to Rook barking, to a haze already thickening near the ceiling, and he understood, in the space of one breath, that a blocked vent in a sealed, insulated house was its own kind of death, slower than freezing, and just as final. He wrapped a wet cloth over his face, took a fire iron and a short ladder, and went out into 50-mile-an-hour wind and 40-some degrees below zero to climb onto his own roof in the dark. He could not see past the length of his own arm. Snow drove sideways so hard it stung like gravel thrown at his cheeks, and the roofline he'd walked a dozen times all summer felt like a different, hostile country now, every shingle sheeted in ice. The wind tried twice to take him off the ladder rungs, and once it very nearly did, his boot skating sideways off the rail before his hand found the chimney stone and held. He worked by feel alone up there, chipping ice from the vent collar with the iron, his bare fingers going numb within a minute of losing their mittens to the wind, his breath freezing to the wet cloth over his mouth until it was more ice than cloth, Every strike of the iron sounded swallowed by the wind before it even reached his own ears. Then, finally, the vent cracked free, and a column of hot draft roared back up through it like the house itself had exhaled. Twice his boots slipped on the iced shingles, and twice he caught himself on the cold stone of the chimney with fingers that no longer felt like his own. Rook stood in the open doorway below the whole time, barking into the wind, refusing to go back inside without him. He climbed down half frozen, shaking, and sat by his own fire for the better part of an hour before his hands would close properly around a cup again. The wall had not failed him. Not 1 inch of the 14 he'd packed and rebuilt with his own hands. Only the one seam he hadn't insulated, the place where fire meets sky, had needed a man willing to go out into a death sentence and clear it by hand, in the dark, in 50-mile-an-hour wind, at 40-some degrees below zero. That was the highest price the Broken Moon Winter ever asked of him, and he paid it in full, and the house kept breathing until dawn. The storm broke on the morning of the 16th, and what it left behind told its own story without needing a single word from anyone. Hollis Bragg, who had ridden out at first light to check on neighbors and count losses, arrived at Ezra's cabin expecting to find another casualty. Instead, he found smoke rising steady and thin from a warm chimney, and Rook sitting calm in the cleared snow by the door like nothing unusual had happened at all. Ezra brought out 2 thermometers without a word of explanation, one that had hung outside on the porch post through the whole storm, one that had sat on the mantel by the hearth. The porch thermometer read 46 below. The mantel thermometer read 59 above. Hollis Bragg looked at both numbers twice, walked to the wall, and pressed his bare palm flat against the inside logs, the way a man checks a fevered child's forehead. The wood was warm, not fire warm, house warm, held warm, the warmth of a wall that had kept the last 24 hours of heat inside it instead of letting the night steal it away. The numbers required no interpretation and no defending. Hollis had spent 30 years building walls that fought the cold and lost. He was looking at a wall that had simply given the cold nothing to hold on to, exactly the way an old Welsh wool grader had promised it would, 40 years and 5,000 miles removed from that valley. Outside, the wind still moaned low over drifts piled shoulder-high against the north fence. Inside, the room smelled of wood smoke and warm stone, and Rook lay stretched flat and unbothered by the hearth, the way a dog lies when nothing in the house is wrong. Hollis Bragg took his hand off the wall, looked at Ezra, and said the only 2 words the moment called for. "I was wrong." Ezra didn't answer with a speech. He never did. He just nodded once and put another log on the fire and let the numbers finish saying what he didn't need to. The knock came 2 nights later, close to midnight, in the last cold snap the valley would see that winter. It was Otis Pruitt at the door, the man who'd coined the name Wool Fool back in June, standing in the snow with his wife and 2 children behind him, their own cabin's chimney gone cold after a wall collapsed from the weight of ice. Otis didn't ask for charity easily. It cost him something visible to knock on that particular door. Ezra opened it, looked at the 4 of them shaking in the dark, and stepped back to let them in without a word about the name, without a word about who'd been right. He fed the fire higher, pulled out every blanket and pallet he owned, and let the Pruitt children fall asleep, warm against a wall their own father had mocked 6 months before. Otis sat up late that night, by the hearth, turning his hat over in his hands, and finally said, quiet, almost to himself, that he was sorry for the name he'd hung on the place back in June. Ezra only shook his head. It kept the wool warm, he said. Didn't need to keep the name too. He never once said I told you so. He didn't need to. The wall was saying it for him, all night long, in 59 degrees of quiet proof. By the following autumn, 4 other families in the valley had built their own version of Ezra's wall, wool packed between lattice and log, canvas over the top, a drip gap at the base that every one of them had learned about only because Ezra had learned it the hard way first. Nobody called it the Wool Fool's trick anymore. Hollis Bragg, who built 2 of those 4 new walls himself with his own crew, started calling it simply the Vain Wall, and the name held. 10 years later, half the cabins in that stretch of the Wind River country were insulated the same way, and most of the young men building them had never heard the old name at all. They only knew it as a wall that worked, something their fathers had learned from a widower who'd once been laughed at on the road to the mercantile. Nobody could say for certain anymore who had first called it foolish. Everybody could tell you what 46 below and 59 above had proven. The idea outlived the laughter that had tried to bury it. The way the still air inside a hank of wool outlives any wind that comes looking for it. Ezra Vane never remarried, but he never lived alone either. Not with Rook at the hearth, and not with a valley's worth of neighbors who now stopped by every autumn to ask how thick to pack a wool wall before the frost came. He kept his grandfather's aphorism nailed above his own door on a scrap of board for the rest of his life. Wool doesn't fight the cold. It just gives the cold nothing to hold on to. Every person who read it understood, eventually, that it was never really about wool at all. It was about what a man builds when he's decided not to let the thing that took someone from him take anyone else. The strongest wall in that valley never looked strong. It looked like something a grieving man had done out of stubbornness and a dead grandfather's advice, until the coldest night in 10 years came down out of Canada and asked every house the same honest question. Only one house answered, with 59 degrees and a fire still burning at dawn. So here's the question for you, and there's no easy way to sit on the fence with this one. If your whole town had laughed at a man wrapping his cabin in sheep's wool, would you have laughed along with them? Or would you have been the one person willing to walk over, put your hand on that strange wall, and ask him why he wasn't cold?